Get back together for a little Q&A time. So, as you've heard Scotty speak, would love to hear any questions. Any questions you have, things that are rolling through your brain. How can we implement this? Any of those kind of questions. This is the time for that.
Let me preface to say, I'm not the expert. I'm just a guy. My life was changed through this. I'm trying to give you my experiential perspective. We've talked about this in these kind of forums a lot, and we're trying to refine our language and our communication to make it simpler and simpler. But it's not like I as a person or I as a coach have it together. And we would understand, those of us who are parents would clearly understand, it isn't like you ever get parenting down, right? And so in this way, we don't get our playing and coaching down either. We just keep closing the gap and giving it our best shot, and that's our terminology. So go ahead if anybody has any thought here. I'll just give you a perspective.
My other question is, we talked a lot, like, Juan and myself, especially about, like, devotions that we do.
Sure, yeah.
So what would you say as far as, like, implementation of this in daily devotions?
So in our operating system, in our network, we're committed to what we consider discipling biblically. And discipleship means, so I direct a school of discipleship, and it's named after my mentor, a guy named Robert Coleman, who wrote the book called The Master Plan of Evangelism, which is a benchmark book in discipleship as acknowledged generally by the world. What did Jesus do with the 12, and what are the principles that can be applied through Jesus' example with the 12 that cross age, cross culture, cross language, cross time as a frame of reference. And so in our coaching network, and those of us that share this philosophical core, we're committed to prayer and long praying. And of course, each coach has a different conviction about that. I suspect some don't pray any more than the average Johnny or Susie Christian, which is frankly not much. And there are others that are vibrantly committed because they understand this is a spiritual war and we need to use the weapons that are not of this world, and they're invisible weapons that have divine power and demolish strongholds. And those folks that have that doctrinal position tend to pray more because they actually think it matters more. So as a frame of reference, I'm giving you a frame. What we find is that most legitimate, sincere, desiring all the stuff we talked about, believers who are in coaching, address things that have to do with knowledge acquisition. Knowledge acquisition meaning to learn more about God and to know Him more. But there's not necessarily a translation of that into how they play or how they coach. And so our desire is that their operating system be different, and not just they be people who know God more because they know more stories and more Bible verses and talk about doctrine. Because there's no correlation, we may not be on the same page in this comment, between somebody knowing a lot about God and knowing God. And there's no correlation about knowing God and wanting to use that knowledge to make disciples, which is the Great Commission. And if somebody wants to know God and make Him known, but doesn't want to evangelize or disciple, that's problematic in our thinking. Because Jesus didn't die so we can have a nice relationship with Him and not go and do likewise in the world. And sport is our vehicle for that. So we're not down on devotional. We want to help enhance people's devotion to God and to man. And it's much deeper to us than what we call knowledge acquisition. Even in churches. So I'm going to give you a quickie thing that we use as a metaphor. I call it the 4 knuckles. The first knuckle is must be born again. If you're going to be a Jesus person, you must be born again. The second knuckle is a person who says, I want to know Jesus, and I want to know him bad, and I love him, and I want to give my life to him. All of that has to do with who? Them. That isn't even beginning on the path to obedience, because it's not about you, it's about God and others. And the third knuckle is, oops, it's not about me, it's about others. Evangelism, the proclamation by your words and your deed, and discipleship, the participation in the maturation of someone in relationship to God and man, is a commandment. And so people generally bounce between those two knuckles. Whether they've known God for a day or decades, generally, in our experience, in the Western world, American church, communities of faith are about sitting and listening to somebody talk about God and us learning about God and how to walk with him. But there's very limited bandwidth spent on reaching people for Jesus and moving them forward in maturation in their walk in a relational context. And so we have exactly what we don't want in America, which is Bible knowledge, mature in doctrine, non-participants in evangelism and discipleship. They don't have habits, tools, spiritual gift and disciplines. Here's our toolbox. Our toolbox are the habits: prayer, Bible reading, Bible memory, learning the books of the Bible through a Bible song, that's Gilligan's Island tune. Bible study, not Bible study, learning how to use a Bible, to use a study Bible to answer your own questions and the questions of others. We have created biblically illiterate, dependent, professing Jesus people who, when they want to grow, go to a commentary or a podcast and don't even have an actual relationship with somebody who's walking with them, so that they might walk with God for a lifetime, finish the race strong, reproduce, and multiply, all of which are biblical mandates. What we have is personal devotions that never translate into horizontal impact. In my experience, as a pastor or somebody who's been in ministry full-time or avocationally through sport for 40 years, he's a young pastor also, a young relative term. If we polled in the American church, even those churches that have decades of history, the amount of people who have a regular Bible reading habit, 5, 6, 7 days a week, of any quantity at all, those that actually pray more than as they go, that have ever prayed in their whole life in a block of time more than a few minutes at a time. How many people know their way around the Bible so they can even study it without helps? How many people in our congregations feel comfortable giving a gospel presentation, or would feel comfortable giving somebody an invitation to the gospel? How many people are in accountability relationships where they give people the right to ask each other questions, to keep them accountable to the word and their convictions? How many people would feel comfortable coming up in front of the church and sharing their testimony in a simple articulation? How many people would even know how to use a study Bible so that they could answer their own questions instead of having to go to a professional to learn sound doctrine? In my experience, in churches that are super sharp all over the country, I'd be in shock if 15% of the regular attenders have those tools in their toolbox, in my experience. That's a problem. It's a major problem. It's very difficult to be transformed, let alone an agent of transportation, if you don't have tools that have to do with prayer, Bible reading, Bible memory, learning how to use a study Bible to feed yourself and help teach others how to do so. sharing their gospel in a simple articulation randomly and spontaneously, accountability support networks, giving a gospel presentation, inviting somebody in a relationship and feeling like they can walk them through that. This is all PhD level stuff in our country, and it should be elementary school. And thus we have exactly what we don't want, is a biblically illiterate, disabled, serious about God country. That's my experience. And so our goal through sport is to give those interested an opportunity to have a toolbox when they come through our program so that they can walk with God. That's hard to do. Most people don't. For a lifetime, that's hard to do. The parable of the seeds says 3 out of those 4 seeds either die or are choked and bear no fruit. Seems like that's a difficult thing. For a lifetime, most people in the faith become less effective the older they get rather than more effective. Reproduced. Very, very, very few people have ever had an experience where they walked in an intentional, that means on purpose, strategic, that means have a plan, way with another human to take them down the road of maturation like Jesus did with the 12. And thus, because they've never reproduced, multiplication has never occurred in their life, being bear fruit and multiply, which is a commandment, is off the charts in terms of a practical lifestyle or expression. This concerns us, and sport is the vehicle to have relationships with people who you're rubbing with relationally for a quantity of time, seasons, in such a way that you can give them a chance to know Jesus that way so they can actually feel the pleasure of what it is to walk according to the Word of God, by the power of God, for the glory of God. So you weren't asking me to go deep like that, but when we think about that question of devotionals or team devotionals or stuff like that, we look at it this way. So there's nothing wrong with a devotional, a team devotional, of course. But we're thinking about eternity and we're working backwards. We're thinking about people who reproduce themselves in a discipleship context as being the minimal responsibility. Not for the specialists, the professionals, or those guys or gals that are completely serious. This is the call of God for every Jesus confessor. And the relationship within sport gives us a chance to, here's discipleship. It's how my 7-year-old learned to eat. I do it, you watch. You do it, I watch. You do it. I ate with a spoon. My daughter watched me eat with a spoon. She wanted to do it too. I watched her eat with a spoon, and she was all over it, but the more I walked with her, it ended up sometimes in her mouth, and eventually, when I was not there, she could get that food to her mouth most of the time. This is how learning occurs. And so in the context of sport, while we're trying to compete like our hair's on fire and maximize our ability ferociously, we also, at the same time, have a vision and expression of giving that guy a chance to watch me walk with God, invite him into a relationship where I watch him walk with God, teach him to go and do likewise with somebody else, maybe within the team, maybe within the community, so that I work myself out of a job like parents should, and that he walks with God for a lifetime, finishes strong, reproduces and multiplies, and walks with somebody else who goes and does likewise. This is our vision. This is God's will, and we use sport as the vehicle, which, in my experience, sport is the very, very finest opportunity, teaching, coaching, that our country affords us to be with people rubbing, we call this rub, a quantity of relationship over a quantity of time equals life transformation. And the sport context gives me for a season daily contact where they watch me, like Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. That wasn't an arrogant comment. That was the Lord's will of how Jesus reproduces and multiplies through human beings. So now we have players, managers, trainers, the community who get a chance to watch godly men and women walk with God and invite them to walk with God so I can walk with them as they walk with God and teach them to do it likewise with another teammate or somebody in their circles, as they then feel the pleasure, because the teacher always learns more than the student. And with the operating system of the Gospels, he designed a way that people are provided for and protected while they go about the business of advancing the kingdom of God, and sport is the vehicle for the relationship. I wouldn't have known Dave if he didn't play football, and if he didn't come to a school where I was working with the head coach who was attempting from scratch to implement a philosophy of competition that he'd heard about and wanted to approximate. And I was in a spot where I was full-time consulting on this, and so I spent weeks with them over the course of the season and weeks with them in the off-season. So in the season, we focused on the play, so we did the football-related stuff 80% of the time and discipleship 20%, and in the spring, when it wasn't football season, we spent 20% on football and 80% on discipleship. And that was our way of continuing to, for me, walk with somebody, a coach, who was walking with his assistants, who was walking with their players, and they were all walking together on this road of the great co-mission lifestyle. The co-mission of advancing the kingdom. The co-mission with God. This is how we think about this. And it's not a hypothetical on-the-wall mission statement that we glance at and then just do our own deal. This is not what we do. This is who we are. This is the Great Commission lifestyle through the vehicle of sport to reach the world with the gospel of Jesus and give them a chance to know God and make him known. So devotionals or Bible studies and all that stuff is great, but we don't need to reproduce nice Christians who don't obey. Another comment. So, if you're old enough and if you're around enough, then you know what people think about teams or players. What the world sees and what you know on the inside are two different things. When I observe and listen to people in coaching, because that's my field, and my field is mostly football and coaching, and although we work with other sports and we work with men and women, and we have coaches infiltrated a number of sports, male and female, around the country, high school, college, youth, etc. What we find is that when people are operating by the world's principles, even as professing believers, that those who observe them or partner with them in the contest, they see the profession, and there's not integrity within the expression of how they play, how they treat the opponent, how they treat the referees. This is problematic to us. This is the hypocrisy that disables the testimony. So when I talk to unbelieving teams or coaches, and they play teams that go on mission trips and have team Bible studies and stuff, they're disdainful of this Christian testimony because in piles and often on the field, it's as bad as everyone else, and yet they act like Jesus matters to them. And he probably does. But because they play in a philosophy that has absorbed the world's principles and goals, what you get is not what you want, but it is what you deserve. If your desire is to glorify God and you operate by the world's principles, the people can't see the connection. In fact, when they see it, they're going to be disinterested in that Jesus because there's not integrity. I'm just thinking about Rick just because he's here in pro sports and athletes. Of course, at that level, you see them being interviewed, et cetera. I mean, do we need to go through the litany of our experiences of people that want to thank God for the win? And yet, if you knew their story, they may have an opposite, complete operating system. That doesn't mean they aren't born again. It just means that transformation hasn't occurred, and it's really hard for the world to want to consider a Jesus that appears to be so inadequate, inept, and self-absorbing. And at some point, we have to make a decision about who we're here to glorify and how we want to live and play. And what we found is within the context of this philosophy, our play and our coaching is actually enhanced in terms of the pure sport, and eternity's impacted. It would seem like that would be a great thing. That it wouldn't just be about having a good time and winning, that it could be about people coming to know Jesus and people growing in Jesus so they can actually be, our terminology, I'm going to talk in male terms here, a great husband, father, friend, and worker. This is important to us because they're going to play a little window and they're going to live for decades more if the world doesn't end. And if my players can't stay married or can't stay committed or can't sacrifice for the sake of their wives or husbands or children and can't have friendship relationships that aren't self-absorbed and can't work and keep their vows even when it hurts, we screwed up. We screwed up to spend that much time with them, and they come out of it with no tools to stay married and stay engaged and work faithfully and diligently with a whole heart, a clear mind, strong will, and great passion. If we didn't use sport to give them a chance to have a different way to live, let alone eternity, I think we forfeited the opportunity that sport provides. That's not my opinion. That's what we believe, and I suspect you do too.
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is super simplistic, but super applicable for at least me as a coach. So I'm all about like everything you said, except when referees make game-changing calls.
Sure.
And I literally, I don't understand how, like, I understand biblically.
Yeah.
But darn it, like, they make mistakes.
Sure.
How do you honor God with their mistakes? And I know you spoke about obedience.
Sure. Yeah. I can. Yeah. Completely. And that's why that area is such an off-limits area within Christianity. And that's why you really can't tell the difference between a Christian coach and how they treat referees or umpires and unbelievers. You can disagree with somebody and still be civil and kind and considerate. If Dave is a ref and he makes a mistake accidentally, or let's talk about the worst scenario, which I frankly rarely run across, and that's somebody with malintent who's a referee that is going to, on purpose, try to hurt a team or the other. I know people feel that way all the time, but I've coached 40 years. And the amount of times I thought somebody intentionally was homering a team, I don't even know if I can think of 2 examples in God knows how many games that I've been at, watched or coached or played. That doesn't mean they're competent. In my opinion, that just, in my opinion, is they're trying to give it their best shot as best they can. That's my opinion. But let's say they're not. Do I have a grounds and a right, especially as a believer, to embarrass, humiliate, ridicule a human for any reason? Do I think the Lord's going to say, good point, dagnabbit, he missed that call. I think he missed it on purpose. So you got a right to humiliate him, curse him, and be inconsiderate. Here's the problem, beyond the fact that I don't think you can biblically support that, is every single kid and fan who watches you coach then says, that's how a Jesus guy coaches and plays, and is now acceptable to the ref, and soon to be parents, and soon to be governing authorities, and soon to be president. I don't think you have a biblical allowance for that. Even if they're wicked, the scripture says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you and bless those who deceitfully use you. So let's say that referee is deceitful in his intent to completely hose our team because he's got a nephew or a brother who's got a kid on the opposing team. If he deceitfully uses you in the context of the sport, I still have a biblical mandate to love, pray for, and bless. I can disagree. Dave, I got the microphone on, so I can't animate the way I'd like to. When you're around a coach whose desire is to glorify God and they understand that this is not a Jekyll and Hyde relationship, I can actually get his intention and with integrity and conviction and graciousness address the fact that I don't agree with the call and think it was right in a way that, frankly, all those who are observing it would understand that I'm working real hard to respect and honor him because of his position, regardless of his competence. And frankly, our opinion, because this happens all the time, is that in the godly perspective, if we believe in the sovereignty of God and his control, then the only way we're going to get hosed if the Lord caused it or allowed it, in which case we'd be wise to honor him and him or her in the process, even if they're wrong. Because here's the bottom line. If God wants you to win, you're going to win, and if he doesn't, you ain't. If that's your doctrinal position. It is ours. And so we might as well partner with God instead of against him. That doesn't mean the contest doesn't matter. I have been in a lot of games that within that sport context mattered a lot. And being unlovely and unkind and inconsiderate and mean-spirited to an official is never allowance. Ever. In our philosophy, coaches will say, but I need to work the ref so that he gives us calls. Why? So you can win? I thought the goal was to glorify God. If the goal is to glorify God, why are you working the ref, embarrassing him, humiliating him, disrespecting and dishonoring, and teaching every one of those kids in the program that this is acceptable business? And every authority figure is open to season. Parents, you guys are coaches. The cool part at the college level, and I trust at the professional level, is parents are kind of never involved. I mean, in all my years of coaching, and I've been around college football since I was 23. That's 40 years. There's only one time ever in my whole life, and it wasn't even at major colleges or professional most of the time, did a parent ever stick his nose in and keep sticking it in. High school, that's like every day. Okay, so you're on that end of the spectrum. And we have to do a good job of educating parents. My job is to coach. Their job is to play. Your job is to parent. Don't mix up the jobs. And unless you got an administration or AD that will protect that, you're going to end up chaos in your school and athletic department if coaches aren't allowed to bring order to the players and their families when they disagree about how I as a coach do my business. You may lose your job. I'm not saying you're not going to. But integrity is more important to me than a job or money. The integrity of my walk and the integrity of my testimony. That's, you got to do what you got to do. I got to do what I got to do. All I know is when people allow for leaven to come in the lump, the whole thing gets messed up. And disorder within staffs, disorder within players and staffs, allowed disorder within parents or the support community or the athletic department is never going to go well if we're talking about glorifying God.
.545. Lonnie, do we need to wrap it up? Do you have any other questions that you would love for Scotty to speak to?
Well, obviously those two questions were probably two of the better things that I'm going if somebody wants some practical, where we live type of things and how you answered it. Really kind of covered some of the things you can set up with in those two questions. So that would be just it. If something's on your heart, you think it's like she might have thought, oh, this is just me and it's really simple. Well, as you can see, it was pretty deep. The answer that Amy just talked about there, because that's every person that coaches deals with that.
Sure.
And it's one that we probably fail the most at. So if there's any more questions, I think that would be it. Otherwise, if somebody needed to leave, you sure could. But I would just say that. Anybody else has something that, hey, it's been on your mind, then you probably should do it. That would be all that I have.
I addended again to say, I'm not saying this is the way in regard to any question. I'm not saying that's more holy than whatever your conviction is about the matter. This is simply our what and our why and our how. And I would expect, just like in parenting our children, Dave has 3 kids, I have 3 kids. Odds are some things we do the same and a bunch of stuff we do differently. It's not a matter of right or wrong or more or less holy in vast majority of cases. For all kinds of reasons, he parents different than I parent, etc. The same's going to happen with coaches and philosophies. And I know coaches who at the end of the game feel like we got to keep the throttle down even if we're winning 70-21. And I know other guys that is so offensive that they would never go that route to appear to run up the score because it shames the name of God and embitters people. There's different convictions, and we have to learn to get along and agree to disagree. And so please don't be offended if I said anything you feel like, I don't agree with that. I would expect you don't agree with that. If everybody here was on the same page, I would be shocked. You do what you got to do. I'll do what I got to do. Let's give grace to each other as confessing Jesus people to play and coach and oversee and parent and disciple and evangelize differently, which we do. But he asked me to tell you what we think, so I did.
So question, based on what you just brought up, it's happened every day at the high school level compared to the
Right.
college level, other levels. What do you say to coaches from a morale perspective that coach?
Yeah.
Say, you got to stand up for your values, you got to stand up for your beliefs, you
Yeah.
got to stand up for your operating system
Yeah.
to determine.
Yeah.
How do you keep them motivated to do that?
Players or coaches?
Coaches,
Okay.
when you have, parents that are going to fight that tooth and nail.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking about their kid, they're thinking about the talent of their kid.
Yeah. Right.
And their talent supersedes anything in philosophy you have.
Completely understand.
Why aren't they out on the court?
Yeah.
Why aren't they playing more?
Sure.
Because we would win more, or we would be more
Right.
successful
Right.
if you would coach better
Yeah.
and see the talent.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing that professing, believing parents are insane. And that everything goes in the toilet when it has to do with their personal property. And thus, sport smokes out everybody. It smokes out refs, it smokes out coaches, it smokes out players, it smokes out fans. People become somebody entirely different than they appear to be in normal life. This is the facts. That doesn't negate our responsibility to be clear in articulation, clear in communication, and clear in boundaries. Easy for me to say from up here. You'd have to know me to know if this is the integrity with which I coached and led players and coaches. For me as an overseer and a consultant on guys like him and those ages, because frankly I'm in the last window of my life, and most everybody I interact with philosophically is younger than me and is still in it. And I encourage people to have conviction and humility. If you got humility without conviction, you're going to be a flatline pacifist. And passivity is going to be your style and operating system. However, if you have if you have conviction without humility, you're going to be arrogant, dogmatic, and mean-spirited. And so we have to travel on a line where we as coaches, male or female, within our personality, have convictions that are clear and clearly articulated, but the humility to consider others better than ourselves without lowering boundaries or standards because we're getting pressure. It's no different from me in the world, forget sports, that I run across people, which we increasingly will in this country, who have a different operating system. They aren't believers. And the problem is generally in the body of Christ, not the unbelievers, but other believers. And how we as a family of God are so unlovely, unkind, ingracious, and inconsiderate of one another, and thus the world has no interest in our Jesus. That's just a frame of reference. So what would I do? It frankly boils down to who's the superintendent, principal, athletic director, and what's that's going to look like from the top down, if they will support you when you're clear and decisive, and some parent with a little bit of cash feels like they have a right, or they don't have cash but they feel they have a right to jump into my world. This is a voluntary organization. You chose to play here. I'm more than willing to coach you, but it's going to be my way, not your way. I don't parent your children, and you don't coach my kids. If they don't play, that's my decision, not yours. You're welcome to run me out of this program. I am not changing. I love you. I'm not going to lie to you. This is how we do business in this sphere. And if you have a problem, feel free to talk to him. And if he doesn't back me, I will probably go somewhere else if he doesn't send me somewhere else. I have no problem with that. Zero. Because the Lord of the universe is inside of me and for me, and I am going to be untouchable unless the Lord wills me to be touched. I am not going to change who I am for anything or anyone other than Jesus of Nazareth. End of story. This is our place. That was a firm view. Rarely do you have to go that spot. But with parents, my encouragement is set the ground rules early. I coach, final decisions with me. If when your son goes home or daughter and you want to curse me and say what a fool I am, you're welcome to do that. I'm still going to coach the same way, but you just hurt your child, who is now taught that grumbling and complaining and being disobedient and hard-hearted and headed to an authority figure is an allowable and wise long-term move. It's insanity, it's selfish, and it's frankly from the devil. And so I'm not going to let him bully me, nor a parent who's driven by their own spirit. We're not. It doesn't matter who they are, where they're from. Don't be bullied by self-absorbed, selfish, rebellious people, or you're going to be chased forever. That's my experience. And within your personality, however you communicate that, I encourage you to do so, or somebody else is going to be running your team. Some parent is going to be co-coaching that you didn't invite into the coaching sphere. I play who I play. They may or may not be the best, but I'm not trying to find the best players, I'm trying to find the best team. And sometimes the best team isn't the best player. So I really am unconcerned about their talent level or your perception of it. I've been hired to coach, not you. I'm not saying you'd say it that firmly. You might be driven to that point, and I absolutely would. If a guy came to me and I'm getting bullied by the devil through the mouth of a human, I am not going to allow the devil to drive me off a position that I've been bound to under God by that guy who hired me. That's, you get a rise. I'll leave it at that. That's what we teach our people. I'm not saying everybody in our circle or network feels that way. My experience is if you let the inmates run the prison, people are going to die. That's not even a joke. They're going to die. Their marriages are going to die because of the principles they learn. Their families are going to die. Their generational families are going to die. And we're allowing kids to watch this. Because they're all watching, man. Everybody's watching how you play this out. And if a player thinks that their coach has a right to humiliate and abuse another authority figure for the sake of winning, you just injured that kid, whether that kid's 25 or 15 or 5. And his future is going to be compromised by your lack of integrity in the sport context. That's our opinion. So, we've learned to be ferocious about this stuff because we're fighting our own flesh. Make sense? We're fighting the cultural norms and pressure, which is vast and increasing. And God only knows how much demonic forces are aligned against a man or woman who wants to see God glorified through sport. And that's why long praying and that concept is my and our conviction. Because if you don't keep the bad angels out of your game, you're going to be facing a table that's slanted against you. Because the enemy is invisible and he's a professional. Don't fear that, fear God. But that better be in play. Or don't be surprised if things go sideways more often and worse. They're going to be hard no matter what. You're just inviting somebody in to complicate the process when you don't take care of the spiritual world in attempts to live for God, play for God, coach for God. That's our position.
Anything else? We don't want to keep you too long.
Thank you for your graciousness to invite us.
Thank you.
I mean that sincerely.